Mara Callahan was 22 years old when the letter arrived. It came on a Tuesday, which she would later remember as significant. Not because Tuesdays had ever meant anything to her before, but because that particular Tuesday was the day she had decided to quit. Not quit anything specific, quit in the larger sense, the give up and go home sense. Except she no longer had a home to go to, which was part of the problem. She was sitting in the parking lot of a rest stop outside Portland, Maine, in a 2003 Honda Civic with a cracked windshield and $78 in her checking account, eating a granola bar that had expired 4 months ago. She had been driving north for 6 hours without a clear reason for going north specifically, only that north felt different from where she had come from. Her lease in Boston had ended. Her job at the architecture firm had ended 2 weeks before that. A quiet ending. The kind where they said restructuring and handed her a manila envelope with 2 weeks of severance and the polite, tired eyes of people who had done this before and would do it again. She had a degree in structural engineering that she had barely used. She had a minor in architectural history that she had used even less. She had the kind of specific, esoteric knowledge that made her excellent at understanding old buildings, how they were constructed, why they were still standing, what was holding them up and what was quietly failing, and almost useless at everything else. She was good at seeing what other people had built and understanding it from the inside out. She was less good at figuring out what to build herself. The letter was in the passenger seat. It had been forwarded 3 times, first to her old apartment in Cambridge, then to her mother's address in Vermont, then to a P.O. box she'd set up when she still thought she'd be in Boston. The return address was a law office in a town called Dunmore, Maine. She had never heard of Dunmore. She had no reason to. She had opened it the night before at a motel outside Portsmouth and read it twice without understanding it. She had read it again at the rest stop and still wasn't sure she understood it. The letter stated that a man named Harlan Morse of Crestwood Point, Maine, had died 11 weeks earlier at the age of 81. It stated that Harlan Morse had no surviving relatives. It stated that, in accordance with his written wishes, his property, specifically the Crestwood Point Lighthouse and the attached keeper's cottage, deed and land included, was to be transferred to a Mara Callahan of Cambridge, Massachusetts. The letter included a name and phone number for the attorney handling the estate, a man named Devereux. It also included a single handwritten sentence at the bottom, below all the legal language, in the cramped, careful handwriting of someone who had written with a pen their whole life. I knew your grandmother. She would have wanted you to have this. H.M. Mara had never known her grandmother. Her grandmother had died before Mara was born. She didn't even know her grandmother's name had been connected to anything in Maine. She sat in the parking lot of that rest stop for a long time. The granola bar tasted like cardboard and old oats. A truck pulled in and idled loudly, and then pulled out again. The sky over the rest stop was the color of old pewter, flat and non-committal the way Maine skies are in early November. She called the attorney. Devereux was a small, precise man in his late 60s who wore reading glasses on a chain around his neck and spoke in the measured, unhurried way of someone who had spent decades saying careful things carefully. His office was on the 2nd floor of a building in Dunmore that had once been a hardware store, and the wood floors still smelled faintly of machine oil and sawdust if you paid attention. He told Mara what he knew, which was not extensive. Harlan Morse had been a retired Coast Guard officer. He had lived in the keeper's cottage attached to the Crestwood Point Lighthouse for 43 years, since the lighthouse was decommissioned by the federal government in 1981 and the property sold to private ownership. He had purchased it for $11,000, which was nothing even by 1981 standards, because the lighthouse was in severe disrepair and the federal government wanted it gone from their books. Harlan had spent the following 4 decades living there, maintaining it himself, keeping it in what he called honest condition, meaning he fixed what was structurally necessary and left the rest exactly as it had been. He had never married. He had no children. He had served in the Coast Guard for 22 years before that, stationed at various posts along the Atlantic coast. "Did he say anything about my grandmother?" Mara asked. Devereux removed his glasses and set them carefully on the desk. "He left a letter for you." Sealed. In my understanding, that letter addresses your question better than I can. What do you know about the lighthouse itself? Devereux was quiet for a moment. It's a significant structure, built in 1887, cast iron tower, brickkeeper's cottage, listed on the National Register of Historic Places since 1998, which means there are restrictions on what can be altered and significant opportunities for preservation grants. He paused again. It also means the property has a value that is difficult to state simply. Historically, it is irreplaceable. Practically, it requires an enormous amount of work. What kind of work? He looked at her over the rim of his glasses. Have you seen it yet? She had not. I'd suggest seeing it before we discuss the specifics. The road to Crestwood Point was a 2-lane highway that ran northeast from Dunmore along the coastline, and then narrowed to a single lane that wound down through spruce trees toward the water. The trees were dense and dark, and the sky above them was visible only as a thin gray ribbon. The ocean announced itself before she could see it. She could smell it first, that cold salt smell that is not like any other smell, the smell of something vast and indifferent and permanent. The lighthouse appeared when the road ended. It stood on a rocky promontory about 40 feet above the water, a white-painted cast-iron tower, perhaps 80 feet tall, with a red lantern room at the top that was dark and had been dark for 40 years. The keeper's cottage was attached at the base, a low brick structure with a pitched roof and 2 chimneys, one of which was visibly crumbling. The paint on the tower had faded to a grayish cream, peeling in long strips that revealed the dark iron underneath. The lantern room glass was intact but clouded with decades of salt spray and grime. It was November in Maine. The wind off the water was direct and cold and contained no warmth at all. The ocean below the promontory was steel gray, and the waves were breaking against the rocks with a sound like slow, patient demolition. Mara stood at the edge of the parking area, just a flattened gravel turnout really, and looked at it. She had spent 4 years studying structures. She had written a thesis on cast-iron lighthouse construction along the New England coast, a topic that had impressed her professors and confused her parents, and led in the direct way that very specific knowledge sometimes leads to absolutely nowhere. She knew exactly what she was looking at. She knew how the tower had been constructed, the prefabricated iron sections bolted together at the foundry, the brick cottage built to federal specifications, the lens mechanism that had once rotated on a bath of mercury and sent its light visible for 17 miles on a clear night. She also knew what 40 years of minimal maintenance looked like on a structure this age, and she could already see from 100 feet away the stories the building was telling her. The tower's paint was cosmetic. The iron beneath it was almost certainly intact. Cast iron from that era was built to last a century with basic care, and several centuries if properly maintained. The mortar joints on the cottage were another matter. She could see gaps from here. The chimneys would need to be completely rebuilt. The window frames were visibly rotted in at least 3 places. She was cataloging the damage automatically, the way she always did with old buildings, before she even realized she was doing it. It was the first time since leaving Boston that her mind had gone to work on something without being told to. She walked toward it. The key from Devereux opened the cottage door with more resistance than it should have, the door having settled in its frame over years of humidity and cold. Inside, the air smelled like old brick and salt, and the particular dusty cold of a space that has been heated only occasionally for a long time. It was a single large room with a low ceiling, and off it a small kitchen, a narrow bathroom that had clearly been added sometime in the 1950s based on the plumbing visible where the drywall had bubbled away, and a door at the back that opened to the stairwell of the lighthouse tower itself. There was furniture, a table, 2 chairs, a narrow cot frame, a cast-iron wood stove that looked original. There were books on built-in shelves covering most of one wall, organized with a neatness that suggested someone who had been alone with these books for a long time and had developed a careful relationship with them. Navigation manuals, history of the Maine coast, 3 separate copies of Moby Dick in different editions, a complete set of the Coast Guard's Light List, the annual publication listing every lighthouse and navigational aid on the Atlantic coast from 1968 through 2021, Harlan had collected a copy every year. On the table was the sealed letter Devereux had mentioned, placed there presumably when the estate attorney had visited. It had her name on it. She did not open it immediately. Instead, she opened the door at the back of the cottage and started up the stairs of the lighthouse tower. The iron stairs spiraled upward in the tight cylindrical space, 112 steps, and every one of them held firm under her weight. The handrail was cool and solid. The walls of the tower were iron plates bolted together at flanged seams, and she ran her hand along them as she climbed, feeling the cold metal, the raised edges of the bolts, the decades of paint layered over the original surface. At the top, she pushed open the hatch into the lantern room. The lens was still there. She had not expected that. Most decommissioned lighthouses had their lenses removed by the Coast Guard when the lights were shut off, the Fresnel lenses sent to museums or maritime heritage sites. This one was intact. A third-order Fresnel lens, perhaps 4 feet tall, its hundreds of precisely ground glass prisms still arranged in their concentric rings, dusty with salt haze but unbroken. In the gray November light coming through the salt-crusted windows, it caught what light there was and scattered it in pale geometric patterns across the iron walls of the lantern room. Mara stood very still. She was looking at a piece of optical engineering from 1887 that still worked exactly as designed, sitting in a room that no one had entered for years, on a promontory above the cold Atlantic, in a lighthouse that had just become hers. She thought about her thesis. She thought about the 47 pages she had written about structures exactly like this one, sitting in the Widener library stacks in Cambridge while the city went on outside, and the way her advisor had said, "Excellent technical analysis, but what does it mean to you?" And she had not known how to answer. She was beginning to understand the answer. She opened Harlan's letter that evening, sitting at his table with the wood stove going. She had found a cord of split wood stacked neatly against the outside wall of the cottage, dry and seasoned, one final practical gift. "Dear Mara," it began, "I did not know you. I want to be honest about that. I knew of you, which is different. Your grandmother was Elise Fournier, before she was Elise Callahan. She was from Boothbay Harbor, and she was 19 years old when I met her in the summer of 1961. I was stationed at the Lighthouse here. She was working at a hotel in Dunmore and came out to the Point sometimes to sketch. We were friends. Not more than that, though I thought about more. By the following summer, she had met your grandfather and moved to Vermont, and I did not see her again. I never forgot her. That is the truth of it. I heard from people occasionally over the years, the way you hear things in small coastal communities that stay connected by old threads. I heard she had a daughter. I heard the daughter had a daughter. I heard that daughter studied old buildings. I don't know if that's why I thought of you. Maybe it was just that I had no one else. I'm 80 years old and I've been in this lighthouse for 43 years, and I'm tired in a way that rest does not fix. I would like for this place to go to someone who can see it. Not just look at it. See it. Your grandmother saw things. I hope you do too. The walls of the cottage are hiding something you should know about. Start at the north wall, behind the shelves. The mortar is loose in the third row from the floor, 6 bricks in from the corner. It was not an accident that it is loose. Take care of the lens. It is the last one like it on this coast that is still where it was built. Harlan Morse, October 2023. The north wall. She moved the shelves that night, carefully, setting Harlan's books on the table in the order she found them so she could replace them the same way. The shelves were freestanding, and behind them the brick wall was exposed, the mortar between the bricks gray and old, and in places crumbling at the edges. She counted 6 bricks in from the corner, 3rd row from the floor. The mortar around those 3 bricks was different, newer. She could see it once she was looking for it. Slightly lighter in color, less weathered, the joints slightly cleaner than the surrounding masonry. Someone had removed these bricks and replaced them, probably 20 years ago based on the mortar's appearance. She worked the first brick loose with a flathead screwdriver, working carefully around the mortar joints the way she had been trained to do, not forcing anything. It took about 20 minutes. The second brick came more easily once the first was out. The third slid free in her hand. Behind them was a hollow space about 12 inches deep. Inside the space were 3 things. The first was a tin box, the kind that had once held Christmas cookies, its lid rusted shut around the edges. She pried it open at the table. Inside, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, were documents. Original blueprints for the lighthouse, drawn in ink on linen cloth in 1886 by the civil engineer who had designed it. 47 pages of detailed technical drawings, dimensioned by hand in a steady, precise script. Every structural element, every bolt pattern, the exact specifications of the lens mechanism, the original lighthouse keeper's log from 1887 through 1921, 34 years of daily entries recording weather conditions, vessel sightings, maintenance performed, and the quiet observations of men living alone on a point of land above the cold Atlantic. The second was a smaller envelope, sealed with wax. Inside it were letters. Not from Harlan, but letters that had been written to him over the decades, from lighthouse historians, from preservation societies, from a professor at Maine who had been trying to document surviving third-order Fresnel lenses for 20 years. They had all written to Harlan asking about the lens. He had never responded to any of them. At the bottom of the envelope was one letter he had written but never sent, addressed to the Maine Historic Preservation Commission, dated 2019. In it, he described the lighthouse, the lens, the original blueprints. He described what a full restoration would require. He had done his research carefully. Costs, grant programs, the federal tax credit for historic preservation, the state matching funds available for maritime heritage structures. He had laid it all out, the whole financial architecture of how it could be done. He had never sent it because he had no one to do it with. The third item was a handwritten list of names. 11 people with phone numbers and email addresses, some updated recently in a different pen. Beside each name, a notation. Carpenter, Hancock County. Stonemason, retired, Castine. Electrician, certified Marine. Ironworker, works with historic metals. Specialists, the exact people you would need to restore a cast-iron lighthouse and its keeper's cottage, assembled over years, their contact information maintained and updated, waiting for someone who would use them. Harlan had spent decades preparing for her. The first person Mara called was not a grant office or a preservation society. She called the stonemason. His name was Arsenault, and he was 70 years old and had been retired for 3 years, and when she told him what she had and what she needed, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Harlan's Lighthouse. I was wondering when someone was going to call." He came out the following week with his tools and his son, who had learned the trade from him. They stood in front of the cottage and looked at the chimneys, and Arsenault said what Mara already knew. Full rebuilds, both of them, using lime mortar matched to the original, which he knew how to mix and his son was learning. 6 weeks, he said. Maybe 8 if the weather is bad. The ironworker came next. A woman named Pelletier, who had trained as a welder and then spent 20 years doing restoration work on historic metal structures, bridges, factory buildings, marine hardware. She climbed the lighthouse tower with Mara and spent 2 hours examining the joints and the flanges and the paint layers with a jeweler's loupe and a flashlight, and when she came back down, she said the tower was in extraordinary condition for its age, and that what it needed was surface work, not structural repair. Harlan kept the water out, she said. That's all you have to do with cast iron. Keep the water out. He did his job. The carpenter was a man named Turcotte, who had spent 30 years restoring wooden boats in a yard outside Castine and had recently started taking on building work. He walked through the cottage once and came back with a notebook full of sketches. He had a way of seeing wood. What was worth saving, what had to go, where the structure was honest, and where it was patched and false. The bones are good, he said. It was what Walker had said about the houseboat. It was what people said about structures that were worth saving. Within 3 months, Mara had 7 of Harlan's 11 specialists working on the lighthouse. She was not a contractor. She had never managed a construction project, but she understood structures, and she understood documents, and she had Harlan's research to build on. She spent her days on scaffolding and in grant applications in roughly equal measure. She learned things she had studied in books and then learned them again differently in her hands. The weight of a lime mortar mix before it sets, the sound a clean iron joint makes versus a corroded one, the smell of old-growth spruce behind a rotten interior wall, the specific blue-gray color that historic lighthouse paint should be. She slept in the cottage. She ate badly. She called her mother twice a week. Her mother, a retired high school art teacher named Ruth who had known almost nothing about her own mother's early life, drove up from Vermont in February and stood in the lantern room for a very long time, looking at the lens. She would have loved this, Ruth said. Mara didn't know what to say to that, so she didn't say anything. They stood together in the lantern room while the winter light moved across the old glass prisms and threw pale geometries across the iron walls. The grant came through in March. The Maine Historic Preservation Commission had a program specifically for maritime heritage structures, and Harlan's unsent letter turned out to be nearly a complete application. She had only to update the cost figures and add her own credentials. The federal historic tax credit covered 20% of qualified restoration expenses. A Maritime Heritage Foundation in Bar Harbor provided a matching grant for the lens restoration specifically. It was not enough to do everything. It was enough to do the essential things and keep doing them. The professor from Maine came in April, a small, intense woman named Dr. Packin, who had been studying surviving Fresnel lenses for 19 years and who stood in front of the third-order lens for so long without speaking that Mara finally asked if she was all right. "I'm fine," Dr. Packin said. "I'm just counting. There are 4 complete third-order lenses still in situ on the entire Atlantic coast. 3 of them are in lighthouses that are maintained by historical societies with paid staff and steady funding. And then there's this one." She turned to look at Mara. "Where did you come from?" Mara thought about how to answer that. She thought about the parking lot outside Portland, the expired granola bar, the $78, the letter in the passenger seat. She thought about the structural engineering degree she had barely used and the thesis on cast iron lighthouses she had written in a library while the city went on outside. "I studied these," she said. "I always studied these." Dr. Packin looked at her for a moment. Harlan used to say that the right person would come eventually. He said some structures call out to the people who belong to them. She paused. "I thought that was an old man being sentimental. I'm revising my opinion." By the end of the first year, the chimneys were rebuilt. The cottage roof was replaced. The tower had been stripped to bare iron, treated, primed, and repainted in the original lighthouse white. The lantern room glass had been cleaned, and on clear nights the lens caught the beam of a spotlight Mara had installed temporarily at the base, and the old prisms scattered light in long geometric fans across the water. The light was not navigational. It served no function except the function of a thing doing what it was made to do. Dunmore found out about the lighthouse the way small coastal towns find out about things. Through Arsenault, telling his neighbor, who told the woman who ran the post office, who told the selectman, who drove out to have a look. A reporter from the Dunmore Gazette wrote a story. The story got picked up by a Portland paper. The Portland story got picked up by a maritime heritage website with 40,000 subscribers. People started appearing at the end of the road that led to the promontory, standing at the edge of the parking area and looking at the lighthouse the way Mara had looked at it in November that first day before she understood that it was hers. She started giving tours on Saturday mornings. 6 people at a time, up the 112 iron stairs into the lantern room. She talked about the construction methods of 1887. She talked about Fresnel lens optics. She talked about the keepers who had lived here before Harlan, the names written in the log. Arsenault, which made old Arsenault the stonemason laugh when she mentioned it. Yes, that was his great-uncle. Did she not know that? And who had maintained the light through hurricanes and nor'easters and 2 world wars? She talked about Harlan. She did not talk about herself, but it came through anyway. in the way she moved through the structure, in the way she touched the iron walls when she passed them, in the way she spoke about old buildings, the way some people speak about living things, with attention, with respect, with the specific kind of affection that comes from understanding something deeply. A woman in one of the early tours, a retired marine architect from Bath, lingered after the others had left. "What are you going to do with it?" she asked. Mara thought about the question. It was the right question. "Make it last," she said, "so the next person who needs it can find it." It was late October when Mara finally did the thing she had been putting off. She sat down at Harlan's table, her table now, though she still thought of it as his, and wrote a letter. She wrote it by hand, on paper, the way Harlan had written to her. She wrote to the 11 people on Harlan's list, the ones she hadn't called yet, the ones whose specialties she hadn't needed. She wrote to let them know the lighthouse was being cared for. She wrote to tell them about the lens and the original blueprints and the keeper's log. At the bottom of each letter, she wrote one additional sentence in her own hand. "Harlan kept your number. I'm keeping it too." Then she put on her coat and walked out to the promontory. The October sea was rough, the waves working at the base of the rocks with their patient geologic patience. The sky was clear, and the light was the long, thin gold of late afternoon, and the lighthouse threw a clean white shadow across the grass of the promontory. She was 23 years old. She had $72 in her checking account and a structural engineering degree and an architectural history minor and 112 iron stairs she could climb in the dark. She had a third-order Fresnel lens and 11 phone numbers and an unsent letter that had been waiting 4 years for someone to read it. She had a building that was telling her, in the quiet language of well-maintained old things, that it intended to last. Some people spend their whole lives looking for the place they belong, looking for the work that fits the shape of who they are, the way a key fits a lock you didn't know was there. Mara Callahan had driven north with $78 and no plan. She had found her lighthouse. "I knew your grandmother. She would have wanted you to have this." Harlan Morse had written those words to a young woman he'd never met, at the end of a life spent alone on a promontory above the cold Atlantic, maintaining a light that had long since stopped being useful to anyone except himself. Maybe that wasn't true. Maybe a lighthouse doesn't stop being useful just because it stops being official. Maybe some lights keep shining, whether they're on the charts or not.